I'm Esther McIntosh. I'm the president of the Federation of State Humanities Councils. And I want to welcome you all very, very warmly to this 37th conference of the Federation of State Humanities Councils. We've had a wonderful, wonderful kickoff. Those of you who were with us last night at the reception know what a gorgeous place we've been brought to. And the halls of this hotel, I can tell, are crackling with all of the energy and good humor and good fellowship that we always expect among State Humanities Council folks. I would only like to say, I'm going to turn this mic over very quickly, but I only want to say we owe a huge debt of thanks to the staff and board of the Pennsylvania Humanities Council for making this such a wonderful event. And with that, I will turn it over to our primary person at the Pennsylvania Council, Lori Zierer. Thank you.
Welcome to our city. Yes, the city that I love, and as we know, and you are discovering, that loves you back. Philadelphians' own Benjamin Franklin once said, "When you're finished changing, you're finished." The world we know is anything but static and immovable. It's teeming with life, change, and the emergence of new problems requiring new solutions. We've never stood still in Philadelphia. From the time of Benjamin Franklin and the founding of the city to now, Philadelphia has always been a place where bold leadership and new ideas flourish. And it's our hope that each of you attending the conference the next 2 days will share in that search for new paradigms in leadership. We are all architects of change in our own communities. And every one of us is stronger when we learn how our fellow state humanities councils are adapting and learning to thrive. From funding to programming to the very communities we serve, change always will be a constant. We know this. We face it every day. It's become more important than ever that our organizations stay receptive to the demands and opportunities presented by the new. And you're going to hear about the new today. Let me introduce to you someone who knows a lot about leadership in the time of change. Paula Marincola is Executive Director of the Pew Center for Arts and Heritage. She's going to be introducing our keynote today, Paul Taylor. Recently selected as one of the most influential people in the city by Philadelphia Magazine, Marincola was described as one of the people who has made this city, in their words, a cooler place to live. We're lucky to have her here with us today to share her expertise, her passion, and her commitment to the humanities. Paula Marincola.
That was very nice. Good morning, everybody. I'm delighted to be here this morning to be with you and to make the introduction for my distinguished Pew colleague. The focus of this conference, as you know, is leadership in a time of change. It's an important acknowledgement that our world is in a constant and sometimes dizzying state of flux, as Laurie just alluded to, and that we are seeking means of successfully negotiating that change. Moreover, as our keynote speaker this morning is going to tell us, we are also entering a new age for our country, one that challenges existing paradigms, but is also full of potential opportunity. The next America, boomers, millennials, and the looming generational showdown, and I always sort of see guns, TV in the 60s. Conceived and written by Paul Taylor, is a highly praised book, described as a rich portrait of where we are as a nation and where we're headed, which is towards a future marked by the most striking social, racial, and economic shifts the country has seen in a century. So get ready this morning for a bracing wake-up call about the current and future reality of our country's changing populations, what they know, how they spend their time, and how they choose to communicate. Information that in turn will deeply impact how we do business and deeply affect how we think about the habits and attitudes of those we hope to lead. Certainly, we can no longer rely on old assumptions about who our audiences and constituencies are, who cares about the humanities, and how we can engage them in conversation that is relevant to them about the human experience. We're very fortunate to have Paul with us today to help us think about these challenges, issues, and new realities. He has built a distinguished career out of identifying and drawing out the salient implications from public opinion surveys and demographic data. He is a senior fellow at the Pew Research Center and was until recently Executive Vice President for Special Projects at PRC, overseeing its demographic, social, and generational research. Before arriving at Pew in 2003, Paul was president and chairman of the Alliance for Better Campaigns, which sought to reduce the cost and improve the content of political communication on television. In addition to the Next America, he's nodding. Did you forget about that? He is also the author of See How They Run, Electing the President in an Age of Mediocrity, and co-author of The New News versus the Old News, The Press and Politics in the 1990s. Paul has also spent a good deal of his career as a newspaper reporter, covering political campaigns for the Washington Post. And from 1992 to 1995, he was the Post's bureau chief in South Africa and reported on the historic transformation from apartheid to democracy. Finally, early in Paul's life as a journalist, he was a reporter and columnist at the Philadelphia Inquirer. So you see, it all comes back to Philadelphia. He has enjoyed a full and remarkable career, and undoubtedly there's much more to come. I'm anxious to hear what he has to say, as I'm sure you are. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Paul Taylor.
Thank you, Paula. Thank you, everybody. I am thrilled to be here. I'm thrilled to be in Philadelphia. We had, my wife and I, my wife is with me, had 7.5 wonderful years here. Among other things, all 3 of our children were born here. It is a magnificent city. Listen, I hope you guys like numbers, because I'm going to throw a lot of them at you. If you don't like numbers, you're auditing the wrong class. I don't know if there's something else down the road here. I'm going to talk pretty fast. The Pew Research Center is an amalgam of former reporters like me, who are allegedly the storytellers, and serious academics and scholars who do public opinion survey research and economic and demographic data. And when it works, we produce a lot of numbers that we hope illuminate important stories. So the story I want to talk about in the book, I want to talk about this morning, is the story of a changing America. Demographic change is a drama in slow motion. It unfolds tick by tick, it unfolds incrementally, but it transforms societies in profound ways. And the America of the early 21st century is undergoing 2 such dramas at the same time. We are en route to becoming a majority non-white country. At the same time, a record share of us, like me, are going gray. Either of these transformations would by itself be the defining story of its demographic story of its era. The fact that they're happening on top of each other has created generation gaps. We are in a moment in our history where young and old don't look alike, don't think alike, don't vote alike, don't use technology alike, et cetera, et cetera. And these generation gaps have the potential to put stress on everything from our family life to our politics, to our pocketbooks, to our government entitlement programs, to our whole sense of social cohesion. The paradox of demographic change, however, is that even though it happens all around us, it is sometimes hard to see. When I was in Philadelphia, I had a great editor, a famous editor, Gene Roberts, who talked about stories that ooze rather than break. Nobody calls a press conference to announce that our racial complexion is changing, that the architecture of our families is different, that the arc of economic well-being has shifted. But every now and then, societies have aha moments where the scales lift from our eyes and we do see it. And I want to open my presentation with, I think, was the most important or illuminating aha moment of 2014. It happened at the Super Bowl. We all know the Super Bowl is not only our biggest sporting event of the year, it is our biggest advertising platform of the year. And if for the last 10 or 20 years, all the big advertisers roll out kind of the new ways they want to engage the American public to sell their product. Somebody my age has been watching TV ads and looking at TV ad families for more than 50 years. I sort of know what the rules are. And among other things, the rules are that in a TV ad family, the parents are supposed to be the same race and the opposite sex, and they're supposed to speak English. That's sort of the way we've done it. I'm going to show you 3 very brief snippets of ads run by 3 of our most iconic American brands. We're going to start with Chevy, then Cheerios, and then Coke. These all ran at this year's Super Bowl.
And while what it means to be a family hasn't changed, what a family looks like has. This is the new us.
So that was Chevy. Now we're into Cheerios.
You know how our family has Daddy and Mommy?
And me.
Yeah, that's right. Pretty soon, you're gonna have a baby brother.
She's not too thrilled about that. And here's Coke. Now, product advertisers are not in the business of making political statements. They're certainly not in the business of making political enemies, not when each of them was spending $4 million for 30 seconds in front of the biggest audience we assemble every year. And surely they knew if you changed the rules and if you had opposite race and same-sex parents and you sung America the Beautiful in a half-dozen different languages, you would get some blowback, and indeed they got some blowback. Those of you who follow this know that actually that Cheerios ad was the second iteration of that ad. They had run that same interracial family 6 months before. When the ad was posted on YouTube, the comment stream got so ugly that they eventually took it down. But now, in front of the biggest audience they're going to get every year, General Mills says, we're in it, and we have round 2. And in places in the Twitter sphere and in the conservative segments of the media, the blowback came. But they focus group these ads to a fairly well. They do their market research, and why did they rush past what they knew would be a backlash? And here's why they rushed past it. Because this is, on the left is a portrait of our racial complexion in 1960, and our right, according to Census Bureau projections, is where we are going as a society by the middle of this century, by 20th century. This is a profound change, and we're in the mid-passage here of this 100-year shift. We're becoming a rainbow nation. What's driving this? What's driving this is our modern immigration wave, which begins in 1965. We as a society closed our borders basically in the early 20th century in reaction to earlier immigration waves. Immigration waves always produce backlashes, social, cultural, and economic. And by the 1920s, we had had enough, and we closed our borders. And for the mid part of the 20th century, basically, there was no immigration. There was also a Great Depression. There was a World War, et cetera. But by 1965, we were feeling better about ourselves. Our economy was booming, and we opened our doors back up. And since then, we're now up to about 43 million immigrants have come in the last nearly 50 years now. This is actually the 3rd immigration wave in our history. The first begins in the middle of the 19th century, and it's mostly Western Europe, so it's the Germans, the Irish are the leading countries of origin. Then when we get to the late 19th and early 20th century, the countries of origin shift. South and Eastern Europe, so it's Italians, it's Poles, Russians, Jews, etc. You add up all the immigrants who came in those 80 years of those first two waves, about 32 million immigrants. Again, the modern wave is 43 million, so in absolute numbers, bigger than the two before, although as a share of the population, we were a smaller country back then. But of course, the biggest change about the modern immigration wave is where they came from. So for the first 80 years of immigration, 9 in 10 from Europe and white. In this immigration wave, just 12% from Europe, half Latin America, nearly 3 in 10 from Asia. If you just look over the last 5 years or so, Asian immigration on an annual basis outpaces Latin American, and that is likely to continue given the dynamics within the sending countries. But while the immigrants may be coming from different places, there are certain things about immigrants that don't change. Immigrants are strivers. Immigrants are optimists. Immigrants believe in the future. And for all of those reasons, they tend to have a lot of kids because that was part of the whole deal. I want to make a better life for myself, but particularly for my children. So there's a phrase that demographers use called immigrant stock, which describes the share of our population that is both immigrants themselves and the children of immigrants. And here you see in the middle of last century, in 1960, about 1 in 5 Americans were immigrant stock. And here is the path we are on. And again, these projections may be off by a percentage point or two, but one thing about demography is, to some degree, demography is the future we already know, because it is already baked in. And we are on path to having, by the middle of this century, a record share. 37% of this country will be immigrants or their children. But there's another way of looking at these numbers, which is to go back in time and to understand that's who we were 100 years ago. And from this perspective, the middle of the last century, which a lot of us of a certain age think of, well, that's sort of the starting point, right? That's the America we already knew. It turns out that was the outlier. The America we have always been is an America of immigrants. And we have been enormously well served as a nation of immigrants. Immigrants replenish the economy. And if you look at these numbers going forward, just in terms of the role that today's immigrants, and increasingly now the children of immigrants, because remember, this modern wave is 40, 50 years old. There's a large second generation now that is aging into the workforce, that is aging into the electorate. And look at the influence it will have on our workforce. And if you look at entrepreneurship, 40% of Fortune 500 companies and 75% of all the top technology countries in this country were founded by immigrants or their children. So immigrants today are doing what immigrants have always done. They are sort of remaking and re-energizing our economy. But to go back to that earlier slide, this wave is doing something else as well. It is changing our racial and ethnic makeup. So here again are the Census Bureau's projection using the familiar categories that we as a society have always used to identify ourselves by race and ethnicity, white, black, Hispanic, Asian. But there's an interesting question, and it's a very dramatic and dynamic question, is how much actually, what kind of job are these old labels doing keeping up with our new weddings? Because something else is going on in this country that's pretty dramatic. If you go back to 1961, when Barack Obama's parents were married and Barack Obama was born, and just for the sake of not starting a political argument, let us stipulate that these events happened in Hawaii and not Kenya. The best guess is, from our looking at census data, that something on the order of magnitude that year of 0.1% of all weddings in the United States that year was a wedding like that between a black person and a white person. That wedding was still illegal in about 1/3 of the states in the country, and it was, I think it's fair to say, a gasp-inducing taboo just about everywhere else. And then if you looked at all weddings that year across all lines of race and ethnicity that we currently define, about 2.5% were across lines of race and ethnicity. And then you carry forward to today, and you see that about 15 or 16% of all weddings are interracial or interethnic. And again, this is a trend very much driven by the modern immigration wave, and increasingly more and more now it's the children of the immigrants. So of all recent marriages involving an Hispanic or an Asian, more than 1/4, quote unquote, married out, married a non-Hispanic, a non-Asian, as did 17% of blacks, 9% of whites. By the way, some interesting gender patterns here. Among Asians who marry out, the women are more than twice as likely as the men to do so. Among blacks who, quote, marry out, the men are nearly 3 times more likely than the women to do so. So there are some cultural norms going on here. No particular gender differences among whites and Hispanics. Whites marry out at lower rates than any other group, but they're still the largest single racial group. So of all intermarriages in these times, about 70% involve a white spouse. So there's another interesting question we can ask ourselves. What are we going to call the children of these marriages? What are the children going to call themselves? And these days, the truth is, we're not even quite sure what to call the President of the United States. So when we, about a year after Barack Obama was first elected, we posed the question to the full American public. What do you think? You think of Barack Obama mainly as a mixed race person, mainly as a black person, and we got the following responses. So a small majority of whites said mainly mixed race, a small majority of blacks said mainly black, but the truth is significant minorities of each group sort of had it the other way, indicating that our very categorization schemes are having trouble keeping up with our new patterns of behavior. Barack Obama himself, like the rest of us, had to fill out his 2010 census form, and he could have said he's black, he could have said he's white, he could have said he's both black and white. In this country, we allow people to identify themselves. For the first 200 years or so, we had census takers making those identifications, and we had words like quadroon and octoroon and literally the one-drop rule written into our guidelines for census takers. Paula mentioned I spent 3 years in South Africa during the transition from apartheid to democracy. This is a country that took racial categorization to pathological extremes. In the bad old days of apartheid, they had something called the pencil test, where the person would come in and a pencil would be inserted in his or her hair to test its kinkiness, and the person was, this is the way they did it, and the person would shake the head, and if the pencil stayed in, that person was black or African, and if the pencil fell out, that person was colored or mixed race and had more rights. So we sort of gasp at that, but if you actually look at some of the rules we had in the old days, it was not too dissimilar. The truth is, we've been crossing racial lines for a long, long time in this country, but just not terribly interested in acknowledging it. And we're now, I think, coming more around. Anyway, Obama said he is black, and he actually got some blowback saying from the growing share of mixed race people who said, in effect, why don't you claim all of your bloodlines and heritage? And in so many words, his response was, and I'm paraphrasing, who we kidding? My name is Barack Hussein Obama. I look like what I look like, and I grew up in the America of the late 20th century. I have lived the life of a black man, and I think everybody sort of gets that. He also sometimes refers to himself as a mutt, and what he knows is through most of human history, in almost every culture, being a mutt has been difficult. It is often the case that you're kind of rejected because you're different and you're a mix. Well, here is a pretty good A-list of celebrities in modern America, and I could very easily show 10 more pictures, and they're all mutts. Now, for some of them, being mixed race is a part of their identity. For some of them, it's completely incidental to their identity. And while I don't want to push this theme too far, because I think we all realize, there was a lot of commentary shortly after Barack Obama was elected. Oh my God, whoever thought we're becoming a post-racial society? I think we've had a lot of reminders for the last 6 years, most recently out of Ferguson, Missouri. We're not a post-racial society, but human beings don't seem to be wired that way. But I do think that we are getting to a better place, a more complicated place around race, where the boundaries are more porous and more permeable, very much led by the young, who are very much more accepting of these sorts of changes. And I think on this one, warts and all, bumps and all, the arc of our history and these changes are enormously attractive and beneficial. Okay, let's move to big change number 2, which is getting older. There's a lot of that going on, maybe even some of that in this very room. Just to start with one more TV ad. You've probably seen a lot.
Ask people a simple question: in retirement, will you outlive your money?
So we'll get to that question in a minute, but let's start with sort of the underlying numbers. So this is what demographers call an age pyramid. Every horizontal bar represents the share of the population of a 5-year segment. So we have the 0 to 4s at the bottom, and we have the 85 and overs at the top. And any time throughout all of human history, throughout any society, when you sliced and diced a population this way, you always got a pyramid. This was our pyramid in 1960. If you go back to 1850 in this country, you see it's still a pyramid. The lines are sharper because there are fewer people living to old age. Now the lines start to move in 1900. Now we're back to 1960. And let's take a look at what is going to happen to our pyramid over the century starting then. So, folks, we have ourselves a rectangle, and this is actually uncharted in human history. And you can bring our rectangle to a point. You basically have to change the boundaries. You now have to start creating more bars because there will be enough people living to very old age, including, according to the Census Bureau, by the middle of the century, about 500,000 people age 100 and over. So at that point, it's the top of the Empire State Building or the Washington Monument or whatever. What is driving this? There's actually two pretty terrific things. There's a lot of good news in this change. There are challenges we'll talk about in a moment. But this is being driven by both an increase in life expectancy, and that's quite dramatic, and a decrease in fertility rates that are quite dramatic, and they are related to each other. Through human history, people had a lot of kids because, A, a lot of kids didn't survive childbirth, and you wanted a lot of kids to survive into adulthood, to take care of you in your old age. That was sort of the paradigm. And now, life expectancy, as you see, has gone dramatically up in the last 100 years. This is life expectancy at birth. And there are people who think we ain't seen nothing yet, that will be at about 85, 86 by the middle of this century, and then who knows what. And there are scientists at work on Methuselah drugs, on little computer chips that we're going to implant and keep our cells going forever. You know, Woody Allen, as is quoted as saying, "I do not want to achieve immortality through my work. I want to achieve immortality by not dying." And there are, believe me, there are scientists who think that is not outside the realm of possibility. We did a survey on that when we asked people. We didn't think it would work to ask people, you think you can live forever, but if you could live to be 120 in good health, would you want to, and do you think most people would want to? And the American public is interestingly divided on this. Most people said, no, I don't want to, but most people said, yes, I think other people would want to, and a lot of people think there will be a lot of problems inherent in that. But this is something I think is coming. The decline in fertility rate is equally dramatic. If we were to go back to 1800, you would see that rated at closer to 5 or 6 or 7. These two lines are both moving in this direction everywhere in the world. Now, they're happening earlier in some places than others. They're happening more in Europe and East Asia and the United States, whereas Africa, the Middle East are later to the cycle, so they're still experiencing more of a youth boom. But it's happening all over. Countries as diverse as Iran and Mexico, for example, have seen their fertility rates just in the last 50 years go from about 7 children per woman to about 2 children per woman. This has to do with women's empowerment. This has to do with control over your reproductive systems. It has to do with secularization. There are a lot of things going on here. There's also this very interesting bump you see right in the middle of that. That is the famous baby boom. We'll talk about that in a minute. Very unusual to see a long-term trend like that interrupted as dramatically as it was, shoot straight up, come straight down. Most people remember what shot it straight up. It was the end of World War II. America won. The GIs came home. We're on top of the world. Let's make babies. Let's move out to the suburbs. And so we go from about 2 children per woman to 3. And it comes down almost as dramatically as it goes up, and that was the introduction of the birth control pill on the market. So very interesting event, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. We're not the only country that is facing the challenges of an aging society. Indeed, I'm going to show you what the age pyramid it looks like in 3 of the largest economies in the world other than the U.S., and the age pyramid will not just turn into a rectangle, as you see. It becomes sort of a top-heavy trapezoid. So this is China in the middle of this century. 30 or 40 years of a one-child policy will produce this. Here is Germany, where deaths have exceeded births every year for the last 40 years. And Germany is now beginning to open its borders to immigrants because it needs. And here is the leader of the pack in terms of challenges around an aging society, which is Japan, which has a combination of some of the longest longevity, lifespans, and the lowest birth rates that the world has ever seen. And Japan has never been particularly interested in receiving immigrants. So you put all these things together, and you have a Japan that by the middle of this century has a median age of 53, compared with the US at 41. Germany is 52. US is currently at 37. So everybody's getting older, but of the big economies of the world, looked at from this perspective, we actually have the healthiest age dynamics, very much driven by immigration that keeps us younger and the children of immigrants. So that's part of this story. However, that's not to say we don't face challenges. And to return a minute to the famous baby boom generation, big pig in a python generation, a lot of kids, they had to build, and I'm one of them, they had to build a lot of schools for us when we were in the 50s and so, and we made a lot of noise as we came of age in the 60s. With, among other things, a kind of countercultural complaint against how our parents and grandparents had screwed everything up. Never trust anybody over 30 was a mantra of our generation. As I've said to people, we sort of had a finger of protest, perhaps even a middle finger of protest pointed at our parents. Well, here we are now. Today, 10,000 baby boomers will turn 65. Tomorrow, another 10,000 will turn 65, and the next day, and the next day. And this happens every single day between now and the year 2030. And by the time this huge pig in a python generation crosses from being taxpayers, one way to look at it, to being retirees and beneficiaries of our great programs for older adults, the math of these programs don't work anymore. And this is a huge social and governmental and political problem. Different lecture, I'm not going to get into it too deep, but just to make the one slide to make the point. You know, my mother's generation loved Franklin Roosevelt, loved Social Security, and loved the idea that, yes, they take a little money from you and your employer every week, and they put it away in a little drawer with your name on it, and then when it's your turn to retire, you get it back maybe with a little bit of interest. Seems like a pretty great program. That's not the way the program works. Basically, the way the program works is the money that today's taxpayers put into the system supports the money that today's retirees and beneficiaries draw out of the system. So the ratio of workers to beneficiaries becomes very important. And in the early years of the program, the ratio was very favorable. If you go back even earlier than that, the ratio was 10 to 1, 20 to 1. By 1960, there are 5 workers per beneficiary. Today there are roughly 3. When all of us great boomers cross over and start drawing benefits, it'll be 2 to 1. And at that point, the math of these programs do not work. And every year, the trustees of Social Security and Medicare, who are nonpartisan, they are the bean counters, and they do the projections, and they do a report every year to Congress and the President and the American public, and they say in so many words, hey guys, there's a problem out here, the math doesn't work, and the longer we wait to tackle this, the deeper the hole becomes, and the more the burden of any solution falls on the young. Let's get on with this. Unfortunately, it's a very big challenge because these programs in some ways are so enormously successful, and they've also become sort of a political football that no one wants to sort of touch them. But it is a problem, particularly if you think about the prospects for today's young, just entering the workforce in very challenging times. So when we do a survey of the so-called millennials, and I'm going to talk about them in a minute, and we ask them, do you think you're going to get these benefits of these programs when you're ready to retire? And we gave people 3 choices. No, nothing at all. Yes, but it reduced benefits. Yes, at current levels. We have half of millennials saying, I'm not getting anything from these programs. We have 40% saying yes, but it reduced benefits. Just 6% say they will be getting benefits from these programs at current levels. And yet, when we ask Americans of all ages, are Social Security and Medicare good for America? 9 in 10 say yes. We do a lot of surveys at the Pew Research Center. We don't see a lot of 90% yeses. We sometimes kid if we ask people, does your mother love you? We're not sure. We would get a 90%. So in some ways, the approval of these programs, even among the young who think they will not be there for them, is a testament to the political genius of these programs, to the fact that they do an enormous amount of good. Without these programs, more than half of our seniors would be in poverty. Because of these programs, the poverty rate of seniors, depending how you measure it, and the government itself has two different ways, is either 9 or 14%. Seniors, when these programs were launched, were the poorest Americans. Today, they are the most well-to-do Americans. Not everybody, but if you look at it, and we'll show some numbers. And today, unfortunately, the poorest Americans, the ones who struggle the most economically, are young adults and their children. So we as a society need to sort of rebalance. Every society is a compact between the generations. I take care of you when you're young, you take care of me when we're old. We do that through our families, we do that through our governments. We need to change the underlying math of these programs to reflect the new economics and demographics. And we're going to have to do it at a time, I said earlier, where young and old sort of are different in many ways. And let me race through portraits of our 4 living generations. There are totally worthless bonus points for people who are going to recognize the movie stills that are meant to depict the iconic images of these generations. So it's interesting. When we ask Americans of all ages, adults of all ages, what is your biggest financial worry? Of the full population, 18 and over, the number one financial worry is the one that Tommy Lee Jones talked about. Are you going to have enough money to live in retirement? The only group for which that is not the number one financial worry are the folks already retired. Because, in part because of Social Security and Medicare, it has done what it is supposed to do. It has put a floor of dignity beneath them. And in part because they had a pretty good run. Their working years were the 50s and the 60s and the early 70s. The economy was expanding, the middle class was expanding, and their timing was pretty good. They are a little bit uneasy, however, about a lot of the other changes, the racial and cultural changes we talked about, certainly the technological changes. It is a little bit dizzying for people of a certain age, They have always been a conservative generation, but boy, hands off Social Security and Medicare, they think those programs are pretty great. The boomers, we've already talked about a little bit about where they came from and when they came. You know, one point I would make, because there may be a few of us in this room, we remember the boomers as the long-haired hippie protester generation, the occupying the dean's office to protest the Vietnam War, and also promoting civil rights and women's rights and a lot of other important cultural changes. That was certainly a vivid portrait of a portion, a large portion, but by no means the entire generation. Little known political fact, I'm a former political reporter. 1972 was the first year baby boomers were old enough to vote. It was the first year the voting age came down from 21 to 18. And more baby boomers, then in their late teens or early 20s, that year voted for Richard Nixon, who was prosecuting that war, than for his anti-war challenger, George McGovern. So they were never quite as liberal as we remember them to be. And when we ask a question of all adults, what would you say in the course of your life? Have you gotten more liberal, more conservative, or stayed the same? A majority of boomers today say, well, you know, I've gotten more conservative over the years, and about a third say I've gotten more liberal. So they are a more diverse generation than we sometimes remember them to be. Next down are Gen Xers. They're now kind of you know, I did a piece on them, called them America's neglected middle child. They don't get as much attention as they perhaps deserve. They're actually a very interesting generation. Children, so they're now in their late 30s through their 40s. Children of the Reagan Revolution, you know, a lot of people think the normal political arc of a generation is you start out liberal and you grow conservative as you get mugged by life. There's a famous Winston Churchill quote, if you're not a liberal at age 20, you have no heart. If you're not a conservative at age 40, you have no head. That was an aphorism that was very flattering to Winston Churchill, who was a liberal at age 20 and a conservative at age 40. But it doesn't describe every generation. And this generation actually started the other way. It started out more conservative politically. Some of you may remember, what was the sitcom? Was it Family Ties? Michael J. Fox, where the conceit of the program was he was the button-down son of the liberal hippie parents. And that's this generation. And the message from, you know, Ronald Reagan was government is not the solution, government is the problem. This is a generation that I think was raised during the divorce explosion. The phrase latchkey kid, as some of you may remember, came into the icon. Now we have the phrase helicopter parent. So parenting norms have shifted a lot. So I think the message that this generation received from its coming of age was, you know, it's a tough world out there. The institutions aren't always going to be there for you. So figure it out for yourself and get on with your life. I think they're a very kind of make it work generation. Next down, and I'm going to spend a little more time on, is this big, fascinating generation called the Millennials. We define them as born after 1980. So the oldest of them now is not young anymore. The oldest of Millennials is now into his or her early to mid-30s. So we can start to track the passage to adulthood and a lot of other ways that they are different. We've certainly already talked about they are the transition generation to an America that's going to be majority non-white. If you look at children born today, a little over half are non-white. Among this generation, 18 to 33, 34, about 43% are non-white. We'll talk a minute about their technology, but this is a little bit of a complicated chart, but it's interesting. On the left, we are looking at the responses by generation, and the darkest line is the Millennials to a question we ask all the time. It's a simple political identification question. What are you, a Democrat, Republican, or independent? And these are the responses of our 4 generations over the last 7 years. And look at where the Millennials are. We've never seen a generation. They're now half of all Millennials say, I am independent. Now, this is interesting in and of itself, and it says something about the desire to be affiliated with what somebody my age would think of as one of the anchor institutions of society. We've never seen this much independence. What makes it particularly interesting is we know how these young adults vote. And they are the most big D democratic, liberal voting generation we have seen in the 40 or 50 years we and others have been tracking this. So there's no confusion about how they behave politically. Were it not for Millennials, we would be in year 2 of the Romney administration. But they simply don't want to identify with the organization around politics. And then over to the right, you see the exact same pattern with vis-a-vis religion. Again, a straightforward question, what are you? Protestant, Catholic, Hindu, Muslim, Jew, etc. And a record number of Millennials, about 3 in 10, say nothing in particular. Many of those have religious or spiritual feelings, pray, believe in God, simply don't want to attach themselves to an anchor institution. And then there's one more anchor institution to which they are not currently attached. And this is one that's been around for about 5,000 years, and it is called marriage. So here you're looking at the share of Millennials who are married today. The share of, when we did this, 18 to 32-year-olds married, about a quarter of them are married. And then you're looking at the older generations back when they were 18 to 32 and the share that were married. This is a profound change. Marriage, as I say, has been around for thousands of years. If you took a snapshot of all adults age 18 and over in 1960 in this country, you would find 72% of them were married. Today, 50 or 51% of them are married. You talk about market share. That is an enormous loss of market share for an institution in a very, very short period of time. So what's going on with these kids? Well, is it that they don't want to marry, or is it, what is holding them back? Well, when we ask young adults who are single, would you like to marry? Do you expect to get married one day? The majority, although not an overwhelming majority, but a majority of single young adults say yes, oh, absolutely, want to get married. What's holding you back? And again, we have various categories of responses, but the responses that register far and away the highest are the economic responses. And in effect, what they are saying, look at me, I don't have a job, I don't have very good career prospects, I don't have the economic foundation to be a good provider, or I can't see it, among the people, I hang out with. And this is a stark reality of this generation. We are a country that believes in ever upward mobility. It always gets better. We don't know how the economic story of this generation ends. But again, they are far enough into young adulthood to know how their story begins. And this is a pretty stark depiction of one of the ways that the economic life of this country has changed. There's been a lot of attention, I think belatedly, in recent times, big book out earlier this year on rising income and wealth inequality. It is an issue not just in this country, it's an issue all over the world. It's attached to whether it's the digital revolution or the globalization of labor markets. There are a lot of things going on, but there's no question that gaps between rich and poor are getting bigger. And you can measure it a lot of different ways, but one of the ways to measure it is economic well-being. The money in this country, the household wealth in this country, increasingly is parked at the upper end of the life cycle. So part of this is a life cycle effect. Clearly, you know, as you get older, you acquire more wealth. So, but if you were to look at this same chart 20 or 30 years ago, the gaps would be much smaller. And if you compared not just wealth, but income, but poverty, employment, unemployment, debt, and all the ways kind of we measure economic well-being, and you did it apples to apples, today's young adults versus today's older adults, back when they were the age that young adults are, it is very clear that this is the first generation in modern history, and perhaps our entire history, that is not doing as well as its parents. And that sticks in people's craw. I mean, one of the reasons we are a magnet for immigrants is the notion that it does get better, work hard, you can get ahead. It's less clear that that is true now. You know, the word for young adults, looking at these numbers, is choose your parents wisely. The richer they are, the richer you are likely to be. That's not a message that I don't think Americans are comfortable hearing, and it is disturbing. Now, if you have fewer young adults getting married, something else is going to happen and has happened, is you're going to have more children born outside of marriage to single parents. So in 1960, 5% of all children in this country were born to a single mother. Today, 41% of all children in this country are born to a single mother. And we know, sociologists know, that being born to a single parent is challenging. And it correlates with poverty. It correlates with, obviously, the difficult circumstance of having to juggle and how you keep a family together and all the rest. And as this change has been happening over the decades, there have been a lot of social commentators saying, we are in for big trouble as a society. The outcomes for these kids raised in those challenging circumstances are sure to be difficult. Well, let me show you some interesting numbers, which is, you know, older folks have been complaining about kids today since the beginning of time. It's one of the privileges you get from being a little bit older. So here are some trends of outcomes for teenagers, and we're looking at trend lines over the last 20 years. And we look at teenage arrests or youth crime. You could cut these numbers different ways, but the trend lines are all the same. So teenage arrests over the last 20 years, down 36%. High school dropout rate, down 40%. Birth to teenage girls, down 50%. Smoking, drinking, teenage, down. Drug use, flat. What's interesting is that the numbers on the right side are depicting a generation that is more likely to be born to a single mother, you know, more likely to be raised in poverty. Nearly half of our children today will spend large portions of their childhood in poverty, more likely to face these challenging circumstances, and yet these outcomes are better. This is a complicated story. I'm not qualified to disentangle everything that goes into these somewhat surprisingly happy trends. But let me just end this segment by saying somebody, actually a lot of somebodies, are doing something right. There is a resilience and there is an adaptability in these young families in the face of very difficult economic challenges that I think these numbers are telling something about. And here is another expression of family adaptability and resilience. This is the number of Americans who live in what we call multi-generational family households, where there are at least 2 adult generations, and sometimes more, and sometimes kids and grandkids. Now, you go back in time, and that was, through most of human history, that was the way families lived. And when mom and dad got older and couldn't be active on the farm anymore, they still lived under a roof, and everybody sort of took care of each other. That was sort of part of the intergenerational bargain. That relationship actually fell out of favor in the middle of the 19th century, the middle of the 20th century, as we passed Social Security and Medicare. And the state moved in and said, you know what, given the complexities of modern society, we need a state that will provide a floor of dignity beneath older folks. And everybody was great with that. We love you, Grandma and Grandpa. We're moving out to the suburbs with the kids. We'll visit on Sunday. And everybody is very happy with that arrangement. So by 1970, 1980, about only 25 million people are living in these kinds of households. But now look what's happened over the last 30 or 40 years. It's gone way back up. Now, there are a lot of things going on here. Some of it, frankly, is the immigrant groups who come and save for the future and double and triple up because that's sort of who they are in terms of the way they see their lives. Some of it is the 50-year-old living in the same household with the 75-year-old. But these days, when you have that arrangement, it is almost always the case, or in 75, 80% of the case, it's the 75-year-old's household, not the 50-year-old's household, because he or she has the money. And particularly if you go back 5, 6 years with the economy collapsing and foreclosure crisis and all the rest, a lot of people in middle age sort of crapped out. And there's a, what's the line from Robert Frost? Home is a place where when you have to go there, they have to take you in. So there's that. But the biggest driver of this growth in intergenerational family household is the 25 or 30-year-old living with the middle-aged parents. And I see some people nodding and shaking their heads because we know that. We know that story. Many of us have lived that story. And you know, when we look for stigma, you know, this is a cultural norm that there are societies around the world, Italy in particular, where the young man has been living with mama well into his 30s, bamboccioni, big baby, you know. That hasn't been our cultural norm, and to some degree there has been stigma attached to this. But when we look for stigma or when we look for stress in these families, we found very little, in part because it's become so common, in part because unlike the boomers who came of age with something of a chip on their shoulder towards their parents, these young adults like their parents. They get along in these households. You have the feeling that they've migrated rather seamlessly from being the children of their parents to being the roommates of their parents. You know, let's text, hey dude, what's for breakfast, you know. And it's not a bad life. If you're not married, you can't find a job. The best thing you have going for you is being a barista. Everything else, you know, mom and dad's house, the refrigerator is usually stocked, and you don't have to put coins in the washing machine. So you know, that is part of now it's a slower passage to adulthood. Where am I going next? So this has left us with a generation of young adults. This, I apologize, a complicated chart, but the dark green is the share of each generation who currently has enough money to live the life they want. And not surprisingly, the millennials register, no, I don't currently have enough money to live the life I want. But the light green is then, well, do you think you will eventually have enough money to live the life you want? And the millennials lead the pack in their optimism. So, are they young and stupid, or, you know, young and invincible? You know, there may be something to that. But the fact that what's interesting is that this generation of young adults, rather than being alienated and aggrieved, is optimistic and aspirational. Now, whether their optimism is going to be justified by their life course, I don't know. But it's an interesting portrait of who they are, and it's an interesting question: where does this optimism come from? And we're going to offer a few theories. One of them is this. So discuss among yourselves, has there been a quantum leap in human friendliness over the last few decades? Or is there just something different about the way young adults navigate their social relationships? And again, if you're not affiliating with traditional institutions, if you don't want to identify with parties, with religion, with big... you don't have to, because you can find your own networks with these amazing things that we now all hold in our hand. And, you know, again, for somebody my age, and particularly a former reporter, the fact that we hold this in our hand, and with 3 clicks, we can access the sum of all human knowledge, figuratively anyway, the sum of all information. And I'm someone who spent a lot of time on Deadline. You know, it astonishes me, although frankly today I'm thinking, why is it taking 3 clicks? Why can't I do this in 2, right? For today's young adults, this doesn't astonish them. This is the only sea they've ever swum in, and it is not just their indispensable platform for information acquisition. It is their indispensable platform for social interaction. And what's so extraordinary about this is they can put themselves at the center of whatever network they want to be a part of. So whether it's the kids they went to high school with, whether it's the kids they play fantasy football with, 1,000 other things, they are in the middle of it. Somebody more clever than me described themselves as the first modern pre-Copernican generation, because the universe really can revolve around them, because they have the ability to place themselves in the middle of it, to build their individualized networks, and of course, then to take pictures of themselves. So again, to somebody my age, it seems a little odd. What is this? You know, and there is an offline analog to this, which is one reason they're sometimes called the look at me generation. They do a lot of tattoos. About 40% of millennials have tattoos, and many of them have multiple tattoos. Now, again, I'm of an age where tattoos were more than faintly unsavory. Tattoos were the world of sort of hookers and strippers and sailors, and now they are completely mainstream, and it is the same impulse. And it is enormous. This goes, I think, to the sense of optimism and buoyancy in this generation. You know, I can post something online about myself, take a picture, and if it's an interesting one, maybe 10 or 15 of my friends will look at it. But if it's really interesting, maybe 100 or 1,000 or 1,000,000 will look at it. And I think they are the first generation in history that can basically be, theoretically anyway, digital publishers. And it gives them a great sense, I think, of optimism. And but there's another part of their story that's also very interesting. We know that generations, starting with the Xers, certainly starting with the Boomers, people are less and less trusting of all institutions of society. I think Congress is down to about an 8% approval rating. John McCain says we're down to blood relatives and paid staff, and we're this is. So we know people aren't trusting institutions, but this is actually, I think, a somewhat deeper question, which is trust in other people. So this question goes, generally speaking, would you say most people can be trusted, or you can't be too careful when dealing with other people? And we're looking again at the responses over the last 25 years of our 4 generations to this question. Millennials only got old enough to be able to ask it for the last 10 years or so, but look at where they come in. They come in less trusting than any other generation. So, and this is a potentially concerning finding, because we live in a fast-moving entrepreneurial society where trust is sort of the grease that keeps the gears from grinding. Couple of quick theories. One of them is they spend so much of their lives navigating their important social relationships online, where, my goodness, it turns out not everybody is who they say they are, and they have sort of figured that out. Another possibility is, I talked about it earlier, the parenting norms. If you think about a 28 or a 30-year-old today, he or she would have been in junior high school when Columbine happened, in high school at 9/11, and the school shootings and the global terror and online predators and all the rest, I think have enforced the kind of parenting norms, helicopter parents. The norms have been, you are special, everybody gets a trophy, but it's a dangerous world out there, be careful. So I think we're looking at a wariness perhaps more than an alienation in these numbers. And finally, and this is the one that's best grounded, I think, in numbers and stats, remember, this is a generation, nearly half of whom are minorities, and nearly half of whom have grown up in poverty. And what we know is that people in a society who feel vulnerable for whatever reason tend to be low on social trust, because they are less well fortified to deal with the consequences of misplay. But in the last 2 or 3, particularly the last 2 presidential elections, a big gap opens up. And again, it's the young who are becoming more democratic, and the old becoming more conservative. This does create the potential for a challenging situation as we try to re-engineer our social safety net. But there is also, to end on a somewhat more hopeful note, those good vibrations that we see across the generations in their family lives. You can see in responses to this question. So when we ask the full public, you know, every society there are group conflicts. How much conflict do you see in our society between young and old? And we have about 29% who say there's a lot of conflict. But when you compare that to the group conflicts people see across other dimensions, it is suggestive that wars need combatants. There are no volunteers to fight the generation war. But as that bottom line suggests, we are a country today that is deeply divided along partisan lines. And of course, so are elected officials as well. And they're not just polarized. Unfortunately, these days they are paralyzed. The last 2 sessions of Congress have been, by most measures, the least productive in our nation's history. Unfortunately, when it comes to issues around generational equity, modernizing that social safety net, the status quo is a step backwards. Every day we don't act on rebalancing our priorities to give a better future for the young is a day that the hole becomes deeper and the burden of any solution falls more heavily on the already disadvantaged young. So in the words of Martin Luther King, there is such a thing as being too late. There is a great ancient Greek proverb that says that societies become great when old men plant trees whose shade they know they will never sit under. Across the ages, America has always been a nation of planters. The Intercontinental Railroad, the Interstate Highway System, the Internet, land-grant colleges, the GI Bill, the Erie Canal, the Panama Canal, the Hoover Dam, Social Security, Medicare, the list goes on and on. Every one of us alive today is a beneficiary of these magnificent public investments. And now the torch has passed, and now it is our turn, all of us, young and old, to plant trees for the next America. Thank you very much.
In keeping with the theme of the morning, I'm Larry Eichel, and I'm also from Pew. I run something called the Philadelphia Research Initiative, which is a sort of local version of the Pew Research Center. And I was up here to sort of interview Paul, which doesn't seem necessary at the moment, and ask him a bunch of questions, then throw it open. I'm going to ask him one question, and then I'm going to throw it open to you guys for your questions, because I'm sure he said a lot of things that were provocative. The one question I want to ask you, Paul, is we've done some research on immigrants, and immigrants obviously are an incredibly diverse group of people in terms of where they come from, age, education levels, skill, in every which way. What you find among the native population, though, is some concern about are immigrants going to, the old world would be assimilate. That's probably not the right word now, but you know what they mean by that. What does the research tell us about not just immigrant, but immigrant stock, the second generation? Sort of how do they do? What's their attitude toward the culture?
Well, okay, it's a great question, and what we can say is looking at the second generation and comparing their economic circumstances and a set of attitudes around assimilation, language usage, and other things, we are seeing a very similar pattern to the pattern we would have seen 100 or so years ago. The immigrants themselves come often with not too much, but a desire to work hard and create a better life for their children. The children get the better life. If you look at the economic circumstances of the second generation of modern immigrants, they are doing better than their parents. Although, frankly, for Asian immigrants, it is a challenge because the Asian immigrants in this modern era are the best educated and economically best endowed immigrants we have ever seen in our country. So they're starting off setting the bar pretty high for their own kids. So economically, the process seems to be working very well. The question about assimilation is a different question, I think, because again, the paradigm was 100 years ago, you come, you lose your old ways by the second and third generation, you're separated by an ocean, it's hard to keep in touch, and America is such a compelling place that we all kind of want to look alike. So the phrase that we heard in the 20th century was melting pot. And in many ways, that describes how the process works. That's not the right metaphor for the 21st century. I think the right metaphor for the 21st century is mosaic. A mosaic, you know, when it works, it does create a beautiful whole, and that whole is everything we think of who we are as a society, but not by the individual parts of it losing their distinctive identity. Now again, if we have nearly 9 in 10 of our immigrants who are a different race and ethnicity from the majority culture, they can't shed their skin, and most of them don't want to, and I think attitudes about race and color really are moving in an attractive place. I think the news on immigration is almost entirely good. Listen, obviously, if a quarter of our immigrants are here illegally and having to live in the shadows, that is an enormous policy failure, and the fact that we haven't been able to get our arms around that is one of the indictments of a political system that's sort of paralyzed. But in terms of mosaic, melting pot, yeah, I gave a presentation similar to this a month or so ago, and a fellow comes up to me afterwards and asking about race and ethnicity, and he says, you know, you had it exactly right. He was maybe a little bit younger than me. His daughter is still in college. I went to visit my daughter in college the other day, and I found her in the cafeteria, and there she was sitting around with 8 or 10 of her friends, and, you know, there were Hispanics, and there were blacks, and there were Asians, and, you know, and I kind of looked at it and said, it's kind of cool, and I said to her, you know, as we walked away from this, I said to her, boy, that group, that's a regular United Nations you got going there. And she looked at me and said, what are you talking about? Because people don't see that the same way. And again, I don't want to suggest that race is going away. It's not. But I do want to suggest that it occupies a different place in the mind of young adults, and almost, from my point of view, almost entirely a better place. The fact that we are becoming a rainbow nation in a rainbow world is an enormous source of strength for us.
Are there questions out there? I'm sure there must be a lot. There's one up here in the front, Barbara.
Actually, it follows up with what you were just saying, that's the transition. And the millennials and generations began to hold office and are elected. What does that do to the political divide between trust and distrust?
Well, listen, I mean, it's a very complicated question, but at some level, it's a pretty simple one. Every year, tick, 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 you know, 4 million young adults turn 18. They come into the electorate, potentially anyway. Many young adults don't vote. And every year about 2.5 million older adults depart the electorate, and that's a nice way of saying they move on to their greater rewards. The people leaving are mostly white and conservative. The people coming in are increasingly non-white and liberal. So do the math. The book opens up with an aha moment from 2012, which was election night when Barack Obama gets reelected. And some of you, and I'm a political junkie, and I was channel flipping, some of you may remember kind of a vivid, unusual television moment. It's about 11 o'clock at night on election night. Ohio has just been declared for Obama, and that gives him 270. And there's Karl Rove, probably the smartest political strategist on the Republican side, who throws a little bit of a mini fit. He says, well, wait a minute, there's still 20% of the precincts out. I know Ohio, and he gets marched back to all their numbers counters, and they tell him, Karl, I hate to say it, but there's a 99.99 chance it's going this way. Karl Rove is a really smart guy. Now, he will do his share of spinning. He doesn't want to be wrong on 11 o'clock on election night. But he and a lot of other really smart, particularly Republican strategists, really thought they were going to win that race. And it was they didn't fully get their mind around. They could see the numbers, but they didn't fully get their mind around what had just happened from 2008 to 2012. Barack Obama had a very tough 4 years. We had 10% unemployment. There were a lot of reasons that you don't get reelected after those 4 years. The reason he did get elected is the march of demographic change. Now, does that mean that it will continue in this direction? And it's a slam dunk. You know, we know sort of in off years, young adults don't vote, so off years are now these days much better for Republicans. But in 2016, we will presumably be back to that electorate. There's nothing certain in politics, and things always change. And we can see among millennials politically, as with a lot of adults, a disenchantment, with President Obama and his performance. I think millennials who don't want to identify, it's not just parties they don't want to identify with, it's brands that they want to identify with. I've given this talk now to Macy's and Volkswagen and other people, and their paradigm has always been capture them when they're 18, when they buy their first car. First of all, millennials aren't buying cars. They don't have the money, get them when they're young. They'll be your customer. They'll be your member for life. That's not who they are. I think part of it is technology. The message of millennials is don't get wedded to anything. There's going to be a better version of it out next Thursday. and make your own way, navigate your own way. So I would rather have the Democratic hand in terms of changing demographics, but I don't think anything is certain.
Yes, sir, right up here.
So I'm curious about why the millennials are so convinced that they won't get any benefits from Social Security. And I propose an answer which is that they've been hearing they won't get any benefits from Social Security all of their lives because Reagan basically started that message and it's been pretty consistent ever since.
Yes, I think that's right. And I also think it plays into the natural skepticism / cynicism they have about all things government, and that's been around a while. I think. Listen, these programs will not disappear in 20 or 30 years, but they will not get the promised benefits. And if we don't do anything by 2033, we will be at 73% of benefits. So these young adults will spend their working years paying into a system that is supporting their parents and grandparents at a level of benefits that they will not be able to get themselves. So if you stack it up that way, there is an issue of generational fairness. And again, the longer you wait, the more difficult it will be to climb out of this hole. So,
Paul, if I'm running a humanities council, I'm looking at those age numbers and I think, okay, big baby boom generation, coming into retirement. Those are people who are kind of interested in what we do. They're going to have time to do. They're going to be able to write checks. This is great. But those millennials, boy, how do I reach them? Do I just sort of wait until they get older, or what?
It's a great question. I mean, I think every organization of any kind has to figure out how you engage with millennials. Employers do, and all the rest. And I don't have magic bullets on this one. I think certainly at the level of technology, you have to meet them where they are. You have to communicate with them on the platforms that are meaningful to them. And I think almost all organizations have sort of gotten that message. The larger challenge, can you get them engaged in the kind of organizational life that people of our age are more familiar with, some of these anchor institutions? I don't know the answer to that. I think the young will lead the old, and I think these organizations will have to adapt to these changing lifestyles and circumstances. A lot of the kinds of civic engagements that perhaps groups that you're familiar with depend on. I think probably there's a whole package around marriage and family and anchor, and yes, then for all those reasons you become more connected to the community, you're more likely to vote and all the rest. That's clearly happening at a later stage in life for these young adults, and I don't know whether it'll happen differently or not. So I think here's a case where the change is happening fast. I think it's older adults who need to be very careful to listen to the signals that are coming from the behaviors and circumstances of young adults.
I think we got time for one or two more. Back right there.
What ranks, benefits, and entitlements do you see the millennials voting for in the next 25 years?
What benefit? In the beginning of the
I think there's a premise. The baby boomers voted themselves, historically low taxes, estate tax elimination. We didn't raise the Social Security tax sufficiently to pay for it. So through the political process, we voted, and I can name half of them now. We voted ourselves a lot of things to make it better for us. What do you see the millennials voting for in the next 25 years for them?
I would like to think that not just millennials, but I would like to think boomers come around to the view that it is a decent and equitable society rebalances that relationship between young and old in ways that I think need to be more favorable to the young. I haven't given up on my generation. You paint an unsparing portrait of our generation, but you're right. I mean, we have left a lot of unpaid bills behind. And when some look at the behaviors of millennials and describe them as a sort of a narcissistic me generation, boy, no boomer has any right to call any other generation. We sort of retired the trophy on that. Is it the case now? And there's a lot in human psychology. Eric Erikson and others. I am what survives of me. Start with boomers. As the boomers now cross the threshold into old age, to what extent will they be open to the idea of leaving something behind? Certainly they will be open to the idea of leaving something behind to their children and grandchildren. We all sort of get that. And there's a tremendous amount of money that's parked up there, and it will work its way down at some point. That's good news for people lucky enough to get it, but that will wind up exacerbating rather than ameliorating the income inequalities and wealth inequalities, because 80 or 90% of those trillions and trillions of dollars will go just to 15 or 20% of the people lucky enough to be the beneficiaries. So will older adults also be interested at this later stage in the life cycle of giving back to other people's children and giving back to a country that has given so much to them? I would love to think, and personally I've been having this conversation for the last few weeks with the new leadership of the AARP, which I think, of course, will protect the interests of older adults, but they can look down, as anybody can, and say, wait a minute, there are some issues down the road, and we need to be about that too. I would then like to think that the millennials take control of their own political destiny. The millennials in 2012 were a very important part of the electorate, as I say. Without them, Obama wouldn't have won, but the numbers are they were 27% of the eligible electorate and 18% of the actual voters. So there was always a lag there. Young adults don't turn out in as big numbers. But you carry forward to 2020. By that time, all the millennials will be in the electorate, and they'll be a little bit older and presumably voting more. At that point, by 2020, it's not that far off, millennials will be 37% of the eligible electorate. So at some point, the millennials will be our elected officials. Congress today is the oldest it has ever been. The age of members of Congress, the median age of senators is 62 and members of representatives is 57. There is going to be a generational shift there, and presumably this generation will look, I don't mean this in a negative self-serving way, but will and should look after its own interests, and we'll see how that plays out.
One last question right here.
Can you talk a little bit about how the context gets urban versus suburban versus rural places in the picture you came forward?
It is a great question, and there has been, millennials are very fond of moving to cities. Philadelphia is probably an example of that. A lot of the big cities on the coast are seeing, they're being revitalized by young adults who like the city lifestyle. Again, whereas 50 years ago, the lifestyle was move out to the suburbs, have some babies, get a car. Now it's live in the city. There's a lot to like about that. There are some challenges around that. Again, 50 years ago, you worried about the inner city poor and the inner city poor, then all the wealthy and mostly white people sort of racing out to the suburbs. There's a little bit, I don't want to overstate it, it's a little bit gone the other way. I live in Washington, D.C., which is now for the first time, but is no longer a majority black city. So you've got poverty now moving out to the suburbs, and you've got wealth moving into the city, again, not everywhere. But I think this is just part of the way attitudes change. I think cities are going to be better for these changes, but it doesn't mean that some of the problems we associate with inner city poverty are going away. The problems around income and wealth inequality are as large as they've been in our lifetimes, and it is something we all need to think about.
Our time's up. One more round of applause for Paul.